Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another NetHope Solutions Center webinar. My name is Madeline No, and I'm with NetHope. Today, our topic is drones, hype, and COVID-19. And today we're welcoming presenters from Direct Relief and We Robotics. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping guidelines for today's session. We'd like to keep the session interactive. Please post questions and comments in the Zoom chat window for our Q&A and discussion session toward the end of the hour today. Please also look for a follow-up email with a link to the recording and collateral on the NetHope Solutions Center. And we would love it if you would answer our webinar satisfaction poll that will be presented after the webinar is over today. We appreciate your feedback. It helps us make these sessions better for the next time, and we just appreciate the feedback. And with that, I will introduce our presenters for today. Today we have Andrew Schroeder, Vice President of Research and Analysis at Direct Relief, and Patrick Meyer, Executive Director from We Robotics. And with that, I will hand it over to Andrew to introduce more of the topic for today. Andrew?
Thanks, Madeline. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Like Madeline said, my name is Andrew Schroeder. I'm Vice President for Research and Analysis at Direct Relief, and we've been responding for quite some time to the COVID epidemic, as many others have been as well. Direct Relief started in China, responding to this back in January, and almost immediately, I think we began seeing, along with everyone else, a lot of discussion around the role of drones in the response. A number of applications being used in a number of countries that seemed to be novel to the situation of the coronavirus pandemic. And, you know, as this has gone along, there's been a lot of discussion, I think, in the press and in a number of other areas around the possibility that drones and other forms of robotics may play a kind of, you know, special role in terms of technological solutions to the problems posed by the coronavirus pandemic. And this may or may not be true. And so in terms of thinking through whether it may or may not be true, there was no one better that I could think of to kind of help think it through than my colleague Patrick Meyer from We Robotics, who has been thinking about this in detail across a large number of countries. We Robotics maintains a large network of local partnerships, all of whom have been engaged on a local level, thinking through how the coronavirus pandemic has changed situations for themselves and for technology applications that they're engaged with. So Patrick is going to talk about what makes sense and what doesn't make sense in terms of drone applications for response to the coronavirus pandemic. Patrick and I are going to talk a little bit about some, you know, specific pieces of that when he gets finished, and then we're going to open up for Q&A for the audience to engage on this, I think, important topic. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Patrick to take us through the presentation.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you, Madeline and Seth, for organizing and emceeing, and thank you all for making the time. There's a lot going on, so appreciate you spending a bit of time with us today. And in the interest of time, I will just jump in and really look forward to an engaging set of discussions and questions right at the end of this. So let's make sure the slides work. So just a few quick words really briefly about We Robotics, just to provide you with the context as to why we're even giving this presentation, and then we'll jump right in. So We Robotics is a local first organization, and this means that we shift power to local experts because we believe that local leadership is more important for positive social change than any technocentric solution. And that is why we are co-creating local knowledge hubs to shift power to local experts. And these hubs are known as flying labs and are led entirely by these local experts who we train, equip, and support as needed. And in fact, increasingly, flying labs are trained by each other, and they team up with each other directly on joint projects. Flying labs are also directly connected to key actors in government, industry, civil society, and so on in their own respective countries. Today, flying labs are operational in over 25 countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And our role in the Flying Labs network as We Robotics is to help facilitate knowledge exchange, technology transfer, and to create new leadership opportunities for local experts. And we do all this through 4 sector-based programs, which are directly tied to the Sustainable Development Goals. So very quickly, our humanitarian program enables labs to deploy more effectively in humanitarian disasters, both large and small. Our health programs enable the flying labs to both deliver essential medicines and to pick up essential patient samples for rapid testing. While our environmental program will focus on enabling the lab to be active in environmental projects, which include agriculture, nature conservation, climate change adaptation. And last but not least, our development program enables labs to be real leaders in the application of these technologies in sustainable development projects, property rights, and more. Now, ultimately, our goal at We Robotics is systems change. So we started by co-creating these flying labs with local experts and then co-creating the actual network of flying labs around the world, which is all demand-driven and continue to grow. As a next step, our focus will be on taking flyinglabs.org and creating the organization as its own independent entity, deeply rooted in the Global South and led entirely by those leaders in the Flying Labs network. And once we've achieved this, and we've got a very detailed 5-year plan for this, We Robotics will then go on to leverage what it's learned in that particular process to enable other organizations to transform from foreign first organizations to local first organizations. So with that, I'll jump into the main topic of today, and we'll tag team with Andrew on this as well. I will keep it fairly high level and fairly quick, but that's really because then we can go into detail and in more depth based on your questions and your specific interests. So we've seen a lot of talk with respect to drones throughout this pandemic, and there's a lot that we need to unpack and also really question here. What you see here is a diagram from Drone Industry Insights, where on the left-hand side, they talk about some of the more novel, new ways that drones are supposedly helping to battle the spread of the virus. And on the right-hand side, they're referring more to actual mature use cases that have been around for a good while and certainly are not new just because of the pandemic. So what interests us in this particular context is really the left-hand side. Those are the novel, applications that are getting a lot of media attention and really spreading quite widely through social media as well. So we'll have a quick look through each of these and then conclude with some high-level points and then discuss with Andrew and jump into the Q&A. So in terms of spraying, we're it's months now into the pandemic, and still today we're seeing examples of organizations, companies, governments being involved in launching more drones for spraying disinfectants in the aim to try and slow down the transmission of the virus. So already several months ago, the Lancet journal, specifically in the topic of aerial spraying in response to COVID, basically, as you can see, stopped. There's no point, in fact, it could actually create harm. There's really zero value in doing this. Now, you may argue that, well, at least it enables local communities to potentially feel more reassured. And of course, from a resilience perspective, and just being able to manage psychologically, having that kind of reassurance, seeing that somebody is in charge, something's happening, is certainly a plus, but I think we can probably find other ways to provide this reassurance that actually is meaningful and impactful in the right way. On temperature scanning, you've probably seen talk of using drones for remote temperature scanning, for remote cough detection, sneeze detection, and so on. I'll keep this one short. It's a hoax. It's a load of nonsense. It's complete media hype with devoid of any kind of critical investigative analysis. It's blatantly false advertising, and it's complete nonsense. Broadcasting drones is interesting application now, specifically really enabled mostly thanks to some new drones that come integrated with a loudspeaker. Here, the results are somewhat anecdotal. We've seen in some cases where it appears that yes, as a result of these broadcasting drones, broadcasting messages around keep your distance, physical distancing, wash your hands, and so on, we're seeing some behavior change in some of the video footage that's been made available in mainstream media and the social media. Then again, we're also seeing plenty of cases where nobody does anything different. You still see the crowd moving along, completely ignoring the drone. In other cases, like in Rio, where the municipality used broadcasting drones, it actually drew crowds because people are curious. So they all gather, they want to take pictures, videos of the drone, which completely defeats the purpose. And the national police in Rwanda also experienced the same, to the point that now they've had to update their broadcast messaging to say, please stay inside your house if you hear this message, do not gather outside, and so on. So again, mixed results. So the really question is what factors need to be in place? What can we do and others do as a community to ensure that this actual use case can provide the kind of return on investment that we're looking for. And this may be due to a range of different factors, and also on the actual message itself, right? That's where you want to look at behavior change and messaging and what the advertising industry does, right? To help affect behavior change, because just repeating something that individuals have already heard on radio or television or seen online 100 times, but having it come from the air is not necessarily going to change behavior per se. So we do need a bit more information. And like any of these applications with respect to drones, are there actually alternative traditional solutions that actually work perfectly fine? So, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Cargo delivery is getting a lot of traction in the response to the pandemic. As a community, and this is an area that Andrew, myself, We Robotics, and others have been directly involved in for half a decade now, this idea of being able to do a very rapid setup for new drone deliveries is really the holy grail, right? In a new country where delivery drones have not been used, where there's a disaster, an emergency, and being able to deploy, from scratch, that's the holy grail, and it's still really not happening now, even today with the pandemic. And the reason is because there's some very real logistical constraints, there's regulatory constraints, and there's also the reality that there is often limited expertise and limited access to cargo drone technologies in most countries around the world. So when you're under an international or national regional lockdown and you're not able to parachute in with the shiny technologies, then how is a country in West Africa going to start from scratch and launch something from scratch? So as a result, what we've seen a lot of is existing delivery services such as provided by Zipline, by Wing from Alphabet, formerly Google, and a number of other drone companies around the world that have already been involved in either providing services or having had recently done demos. They've been able to pivot and start actual deliveries related to COVID, but none of them have started from scratch. Not a single one have all of a sudden said, oh, I know, we'll start doing delivery drones as a result. So don't be fooled. There are now, I think, 16 countries where we've documented where this technology is being used for delivery in the context of the pandemic. It's not magic. There's a lot of work that's already been gone into that. And what we're also seeing in general, that's been the case for the past several years in the delivery space in terms of public health, is that the big players, the big delivery drone companies will focus on the areas of most demand. Because from a business model perspective, return on investment and so on, being able to do 150 deliveries per day is kind of where they can actually start breaking even. Whereas if it's anything below that, then it's not really of interest to them. So then what do you do in very rural, remote, dispersed communities where you don't necessarily need more than 150 deliveries per year, not even just per day. So those tend to get overlooked time and time again. And of course, it's not just because we've got delivery drones that traditional supply chain delivery goes out the window, motorbikes and other ground delivery technologies. If you are interested in learning more about this, we have a detailed study on this. If you just go to werobotics.org/COVID, this is being updated on an almost daily basis, and you'll get a lot of insights on how some regulations are changing and what technology is being used in which countries for which specific use cases around the pandemic. And if you want to dive even deeper, we have a professional peer-reviewed online training specifically on medical cargo drones for public health. That is a certificate-based training that we all very much invite you to join. And if you're also interested in humanitarian uses of drones, so in terms of disaster risk management, we also have a dedicated online peer-reviewed training that really, like the health course, captures half a decade of experience that we've had, firsthand experience that we've had in this space, and also brings in the best practices and lessons learned from the broader community. So feel free to check that out. Surveillance, in many respects, is why drones started in the first place, right? To get a bird's eye view of what's going on, to get more situational awareness. So this application is not particularly new, but in the context of a pandemic, which is somewhat new for many of us in our lifetime, it is, we've seen a rapid extension of this technology for surveillance purposes. And again, here, like the broadcasting drones, we're seeing a mix of results. In some cases, it appears that it's being effective, that it allows the authorities, law enforcement, and so on to really help maintain adherence to the recommendations provided by government, again, physical distancing and so on, and respecting the lockdowns. In other cases, it doesn't seem to really work that much. It seems to be like drone companies just looking to get some media coverage for doing something that actually doesn't have any impact. And again, the difference may be the result of different factors, and not only the ones you see here, but political, historical factors as well. And then, of course, one of the biggest overarching issues that have been around since drones have been more popular since really 2013 is privacy concerns, but it's even more serious in this case because you literally are seeing some governments crowdsource drone pilots to do surveillance in their own communities, right? So what does that mean in terms of the privacy implications? And we've already seen plenty of evidence of government overreach in basically leveraging this technology and implementing it for surveillance, which is unlikely to disappear once the worst of the pandemic, once we're over the worst of the pandemic. So, and again, it's not because drones are around that all of a sudden the way that law enforcement and other authorities have been using technology to do surveillance that we're going to forget that, right? So police cars going on patrol, that's been something that's been used before. That doesn't have to all of a sudden go away just because we have drones. And what's really quite striking to me is we've seen plenty of examples of police departments in dozens and dozens of countries around the world, in capital cities in particular, say, we need these drones for aerial surveillance and so on. That way we don't get stuck in traffic. But I mean, you look at the video footage, there's zero to no traffic in these major cities. And so why aren't you just using what has worked in the past? So again, in some cases, there are compelling reasons where this actually does add. In others, it seems unnecessary. It seems like there are other motives behind the application of this technology. As far as other types of applications, connectivity, this is actually a relatively new use case for drones, and it's coming from a discussion we are having thanks to Andrew and with NetHope and Cisco around the possibility of setting up what many of us refer to as flying cell phone towers in areas where maybe traditional communication infrastructure is not available or is not particularly reliable. Being able to have these tethered drones in the air for 6 weeks on end could potentially fill a gap. But again, what are the alternative solutions, and really what does it take to actually provide this kind of service? Because you do still need electricity, and so if you're in an area where the electricity supply is not particularly reliable, then your drone is simply not going to be flying for very long. Wrapping up with a couple more use cases, mapping is also obviously not new as a use case. It is more new in terms of how it's being applied to the context, which is a pandemic. We've seen more of this come out in countries like India, where the police have basically, according to them, and this has been very useful, they've been interviewed and they say, yes, by having population data overlaid on this high resolution imagery, we have current imagery, and obviously we want to know about population density because that's obviously going to be a factor in terms of transmission. And according to these different police departments, they've been able to use this imagery for setting up screening centers, also for logistics, to provide delivery routes, and so on. And again, the question is, well, how about satellite imagery? Why is that potentially not as useful in this case? Why turn to drones? And there are some good answers to that, and we can unpack that further in the discussion. And then lastly, a rather curious application, QR codes. We've only seen this used in China, and this is actually a photo taken just outside of Shenzhen, right by some toll booth. So highways coming into Shenzhen, the government has been flying these drones with these big poster of QR codes, asking passengers, drivers, and so on to basically scan in a way, like to kind of check in, to let the government know that they're coming into the city. And we know that the Chinese government has been using QR code for tracking purposes from the very first days of the pandemic. So chances are this is all directly integrated into their whole QR code tracking system. Need a bit more information. There's been very little shared as to how effective this is. One question might be why put the poster on a drone when you can put it at the toll booth on the exit of the highway? Is it to capture attention? Who knows? It's uncertain. All right, so just gonna conclude with a few quick points and then hand it over back to Andrew. One of the reasons we're talking about all this and the context within which we're talking about all this is with respect to this code of conduct that's been around for over half a decade, 6-7 years now. It's been informed and developed by dozens of humanitarian organizations over the course of several years. This code of conduct at uavcode.org documents a lot of do's and don'ts that come from firsthand experience and frankly, a lot of pain points and mistakes that were done in the early days in 2013, 2014, 2015 in the application of drone technology in humanitarian settings. So we already know, what some of the do's and don'ts are and best practices. For example, the use of this technology has to be very much driven through a needs-based model, and that we have to also compare whether this technology is indeed more effective, more applicable, useful in this particular context than any other technology. So that knowledge base already exists, and it's a matter of making sure that we consult this, very rich knowledge base in order to make sure that this informs our decisions on how we use this technology. So just in conclusion then, some applications, as you've seen, make no sense. The spraying of disinfectants is ridiculous. People who suffer already from respiratory issues like asthma are adversely affected by this. The whole nonsense around the temperature scanning is a complete hoax. The mature applications remain completely valid. They're just not as sexy, and so the media doesn't really run with it at all. But those are quite potentially the most important, the most impactful applications and use cases for this technology. And then, of course, COVID does not have a monopoly on disasters. We've already seen Vanuatu being hit by a Category 5 cyclone. We're seeing other countries facing large and small, but frequent small disasters, and those are not going to go away. In fact, I mean, it's climate emergencies, and so things are going to get more challenging. And so it is, while I understand it on one hand, it is at the same time quite concerning to me that we're seeing major players in the humanitarian space, including donors, just zero in on just the COVID response and nothing else. And in the meantime, you've got, because of the lockdowns, you've got immunization programs that have been shut down, and you're going to get dengue outbreaks and all kinds of food security issues. And those don't go away. And so we already know how drones can be used effectively and meaningfully in those adjacent crises. So let's not all fixate on one emergency, because we don't have the luxury of just dealing with emergencies sequentially. Long-term opportunities here are really important. It's clear, as we've seen in terms of like delivery drones in response to the pandemic, that's the vast majority of examples we're documenting come from the global north. So what we should be doing with our time in medium to long-term horizon is building that local capacity, transferring the technology in a sustainable manner so that expertise and technology exists locally. You don't need to fly in a for-profit company from Silicon Valley to set something up in a new country in the global south. And so that speaks really to the digital divide and the importance of really localizing this expertise and the technology in a way that is, again, sustainable and ethical, responsible, and dignified. And to give you one of my favorite examples of this technology in response to COVID is with our friends at Nepal Flying Labs in Kathmandu. They've been trying with 3 municipalities in Kathmandu Valley here to actually map the whole valley for years. It's an incredibly dense area, and having very high resolution aerial imagery and ortho-rectified mosaics of this area could be incredibly useful for disaster risk management, disaster preparedness, urban planning, and so on. But there's a major international airport right there in the valley, and so they've not been able to secure flight permissions until today. A few weeks ago, finally, the Civil Aviation Authority in Nepal said, all right, there's virtually no air traffic, go for it. So this is they started the first phase of this with 2 of the municipalities. Is it sexy, like spraying drones and temperature detection drone? No, but it actually works and actually have meaningful impact. Lastly, and I'll definitely end with this slide, if you are thinking of using drones in response to the pandemic, or if you're hearing about others, this is a very simple, potentially obvious decision tree to go through, right? So if you want to move forward, well, the first question you ask yourself is, have you actually asked those end users who would ultimately be the ones using your solution as to what they actually need, right? And it's incredible how that step gets skipped 95% of the time by folks who are really excited about the technology. And if you have done that, then, well, do they have other tools that already do the trick? And if yes, then okay, frankly, get out of the way, just go away. Now, if they see some merit in what you're proposing, the next step to think about is, well, what are the policy frameworks within which this has to actually be deployed? What are the drone regulations? What are the privacy implications? Any other legal implications that need to be factored in? Do you actually understand that particular landscape? And if you don't, then you had better check that out first, because the consequences could be quite severe. And even if you are familiar and you understand the privacy policy, legal frameworks, you've done your homework, this still does not guarantee that you have a good idea. It could work. And in that case, if you get to that point, then based on best practice, a quick, short, pilot project proof of concept is advisable in order to get direct feedback from those end users. So that's it for me. There's a lot more on the use of drones and the coronavirus on our website, robotics.org/COVID. So this is something that's being updated on a very regular basis as well. So feel free to consult that. And with this, I will hand over to Andrew for the next part of this webinar.
Thank you, Patrick. And I'm going to hand it right back quickly. So I thought we would actually dig into a couple of these points. In fact, actually, one of the things that it reminded me of when, listening to you talk now and thinking about, the process whereby drones have, I think, matured around, a lot of the use cases you've discussed. It reminded me, and then my own experience with the coronavirus response and other technologies, actually. It reminded me of actually a conversation that you and I had, actually a debate with a fairly prominent person in a large development humanitarian agency a while ago that was quite critical of drones around remote control response, and this idea that somehow drones are problematic kind of per se within the context of humanitarian and development use cases because of remote control, and this kind of removal of the technology from the kind of space of kind of social life and activity. And it struck me that, thinking about a lot of these cases, that this is precisely what has kind of energized a lot of the new activity in these use cases around, the idea in a context of social distancing, where, social space is being divided in a new way, in a way that none of us have necessarily experienced in our lifetimes before, that this is then precisely this moment where, oh, perhaps there are, kind of these new remote control kind of functions that will come in to take the place of, things that we otherwise would have done, kind of like, Zoom call on steroids, right? Where we're all thinking about this. It reminded me of contact tracing questions. So there's been a lot of discussions around, digital contact tracing as a way to kind of, utilize technology to, in a remote context, turbocharge, things that we need to do, like, trace who's been in contact and exposed to a virus. On the other hand, of course, where we've seen contact tracing right now, for instance, be really effective is in these contexts where we already have established networks of people that are doing the work, right? Where this is one of the reasons I think why African governments have been relatively effective in the response to the coronavirus, that there are already these networks of people that are experienced in other outbreaks, and where you don't have those networks in place, or you had to build them from scratch, you're way behind. So reliance on just purely remote solutions is becoming increasingly problematic. It has this sort of like, hype wave where there's a lot of energy around, the technological application, which quickly peters out because it doesn't have sustainable social support. So I guess, like, coming back to some of these questions, like, how do we, what is the way that you avoid having, drone applications simply fall back into remote control in this case? Like, how do we make sure that that is not the way that we're approaching this, that we're actually dealing with this in a way that expands, these kind of bases of local connection?
Wow, that's a great question. Thanks very much, Andrew. And yeah, I mean, I guess, you and I, and certainly everybody else on this call, have been involved in humanitarian space for a good 10 plus years now. And, I remember in 2005, 2006, when some of us at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative were starting to look at the role of technology in humanitarian crises, and we were starting to look at SMS, and could we use SMS for crowdsourcing, even though we weren't using that word then, in order to do this kind of damage impact needs assessments and so on. And 15 years ago, the response from a number of, not just one, but a number of humanitarian organizations was no, this kind of remote, it's just not going to work. We have to be with, affected communities. We have to be there in person, psychologically, and there's some very good reasons why that is a good idea, of course. But they definitely wrote off this idea. And then a few years later, social media is exploding, and so we're starting to look at, okay, how do we leverage user-generated content in humanitarian settings? And again, you have the same type of organizations coming back. No, like this, we have to communicate in person, talk, interview. When we do these damage assessments and so on, it has to be in person. And also, writing this off. And then, I still remember a very interesting conversation with another humanitarian organization a few years later when drones were going into major hype mode, where one humanitarian was basically saying, with respect to delivery drones, no, like this completely like dehumanizes it, removes the humanity of what is key to humanitarian response, and having humanitarian professionals on site, medical professionals on site, and serving local communities and so on. And my response to that was, but listen, when the drone delivers the essential medicine, it goes to a local hospital or a local clinic, to local health providers and health practitioners who then treat the patients. Like, it's still human to human. So and it's just, it comes back every few years with a new technology. It comes back. Now, to answer your question, I don't have all the answers, and I'll be biased in my own answer. In the way we see it, taking a local first approach is the way to go, and helping to complement the expertise that already exists to allow local experts to be able to be the ones who are the first responders, and who have access to these latest technologies, and who have the expertise to then provide this kind of service in a way that's continuous and still to a certain extent localized, because you're not having somebody from 12,000 kilometers away who parachutes in to provide kind of remote control. It's kind of localized remote control. I don't know if that overcomes all the problems that exist and the challenges that exist with remote control, but I would be very curious to hear your answer, Andrew, to that. What are your thoughts? That's a fascinating question, and I think I haven't seen that question actually come up in the context, specifically just in the historical context of, wait, we spent 15 years looking at humanitarian innovation and technology with a number of more conservative humanitarian organizations going, no, but you're removing the human element. You're removing the human element. Meanwhile, the term digital natives that was coined by Ethan Zuckerman 10, 15 years ago, now everybody's a digital native. So so as we've seen in some refugee studies and so on, some affected communities prefer to communicate via WhatsApp more than perhaps even in person, right? So I think it's important for us to also meet, local communities to, based on their information ecosystem. But anyway, I would really like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that it's a I really like the idea that it's actually more about like the situation and the intent of the project than the tech itself, actually. So like where remote control seems to me to become most problematic is actually about power dynamics, where you're trying to remove the locus of control from a population and have a technical system that kind of stands in for other things. So in the case of drones, I think where we've been most concerned is around, say, the surveillance use cases that you brought up, right? So that, well, we've seen a lot of governments sort of just blow the doors open in terms of new surveillance practices. Drones are one, obviously not the only one. There's been a lot of concern around social media tracing of GPS activity through your device, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a concern that there's a leveling up of kind of social control on the government side in the context of the pandemic that may not necessarily be effective in stopping the pandemic. It's just a new form of control. That to me isn't just about the tech, actually. That's actually about the way that we choose to implement it. So like first principle in the UAV code of conduct in that sense is about like, you know, make the use case appropriate to the situation that you're working with and consult the community, so that we make the social dynamic part of the technology, and that helps us to kind of answer the first question about the effectiveness of the technology. So, you know, I think that is something that we always kind of have to come back to in these cases, to make sure that we're thinking about these not just as technical solutions, because that's where you're most at risk of, I think, the worst form of remote control, which is really like giving up control towards, you know, folks that may not necessarily have local interests sort of in mind. You know, if we come back around to this question around, you know, privacy and surveillance, I mean, you know, this is obviously like very different in different contexts. What have you seen from the labs coming back as people have, you know, been asked to do various things? What kinds of, you know, what have been some of the concerns that have been voiced around a lot of different, you know, contexts around privacy and surveillance? Has it been, you know, kind of the same set of issues, or have there been a lot of different discussions that are more kind of situational? Depending on the country.
Thanks, Andrew. That's really great questions. What's been interesting to me is how a number of governments in which, a number of countries where the flying labs are operational, their governments have, the authorities have gone to the flying labs and said, please, 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 please do the surveillance. We need surveillance yesterday. Please get all these streets completely disinfected by aerial drones. And they've kind of been, you know, when government tells you to do something in many countries, you can politely say, but listen, we're not entirely sure it's effective. But if they tell you to do it anyway, then you kind of get roped in and you're expected to just, you know, kind of step in line. So the flying labs have had to play a bit of a delicate diplomatic role where they've had to give in a little bit. And then by giving a little bit, to also then try and educate and inform government partners as to some of the, you know, constraints in using these drones in these different ways. What was fascinating in one country where flying labs are operational, where they were asked to support you know, this kind of surveillance, it was not the government that talked about data privacy. It was actually the flying labs that said, okay, well, we can look this up, but we need these privacy measures in place and these protocols in place in terms of being very much core to the workflow as to how we're doing that. So a lot of that is not actually coming from government. I think, and obviously it's understandable that governments are, you know, countries are in a status of emergency. There's a lot of anxiety and stress. There's a lot of, you know, knee-jerk reactions of just do something, anything, get it done, you know, and sometimes, you know, somewhat on the verge of panic. And so they'll do anything, they'll try anything. But it has been reassuring to see that the labs, while they've had to still follow what they've been asked to do, in some cases have also been the ones who've taken the lead and say, okay, but listen, you know, there's actually a health consequence of doing this spraying. There's actually some serious privacy issues that we need to take into account, and this is how to mitigate the risks, and so on. So that's what we've seen. I mean, all these applications that we've shared with you, you know, those have been discussions we've had, extensive discussions we've had with all 25 plus labs around the world. We're doing these regional calls on a very regular basis now to provide them with, you know, more support so that they can go back to the government and say, but listen, look at this study that's fully referenced by We Robotics. This is really not very helpful, you know. So that is coming very helpful based on the feedback we're getting from the lab. So I don't know, I answered the question in one angle. Maybe you were also asking it in a different angle, and I'm also happy to take any of the questions that have been shared by folks who kindly joined us too.
Yeah, sure. Let me go to the first one of those actually, because I think it picks up some of what you were just talking about. This is from Nassim Motalebi, and he asked about studies that evaluate perception associated with drones. I think this is asked a lot in not just in the context of COVID response, but you know, studies or otherwise. Have you, you talked a little bit about, say, the change in the capacity to operate in Nepal where air traffic went away. Has there been a change that that you've picked up in perception around these new applications? Has it gone positive, negative, sideways? You know, what has been change in perception on the community level from your sense?
That's a great question, and here I really rely on what I'm learning from the flying labs. Being based in Switzerland, I don't have that firsthand, but it's actually a great question because a number of the flying labs are actually putting together an online training focused on community engagement in drone projects. And the reason I bring that up is because if you do proper community engagement, you're obviously going to increase the chances that the perception of what you're doing is far more positive. Whereas there was literally one humanitarian organization that told me directly, I don't know why they told me, that, you know, they had not done community engagement and their drone pilots were literally chased out of an area because they didn't bother doing any kind of community engagement. So perception is going to be a factor, obviously, of how prepared you are and the skills and knowledge and training you have on how you do appropriate community engagement. Now, that said, of course, since, you know, I the time I first picked up a drone in 2013 and started flying it around versus, you know, literally yesterday, yeah, it's become part of you know, popular culture to a certain extent. In some countries, it's no longer something that is as novel. People have seen it, they've seen the videos, they've seen the pictures, and so it's not as much of an issue. And from what I ask this question quite often actually to flying labs, and I'm hearing the same thing from them. Like, more often than not, it's very, very rare that they're going even to you know, rural communities where people have not actually heard of a drone. And I gave you a personal experience last year when we were in the very remote mountains of the Dominican Republic for a drone delivery project with Pfizer delivering essential medicines. We were talking to some kids about this delivery drone that we had, and one kid said, "Oh, I'll be right back." He came back 5 minutes later, had gone back to his place to pick up a small drone, a small quadcopter. And this is an area where you don't have regular electricity, don't have regular access to healthcare and so on. And this kid had his toy, and he flew it phenomenally well, by the way. So that perception has changed, but that does not mean that it gives us anybody an excuse not to do proper community engagement. That's really, really, really important.
So that's a natural segue to the question that we received here from Seth Otto, which goes back to the code of conduct. And Seth was asking here about the broad expectations that we should have around ethical drone use. So accountability for decision makers. I'm assuming we mean decision makers at multiple levels here, from decision makers at the operator level, decision makers at the organizational and the regulatory level. But how have you, so maybe you could dig a little bit more into, like, what's the you know, kind of framework here for how to determine ethical drone use, you know, either in humanitarian or in these specific pandemic cases?
That's a really great question, and something I really enjoy talking about. So I'm going to try and not use the next 10 minutes for that. I'll just say, you know, that that code of conduct is there because based on these multiple, you know, open multi-stakeholder consultations we've had with dozens of humanitarian organizations over the years, all those protocols and guidelines that you'll find in the code of conduct are guidelines that help you ensure that you're applying this technology in an ethical way. There's not just one thing or three, you know, magic bullet points that will necessarily guarantee that what you're doing is ethical. I often tell drone companies in particular that I don't really give rats ass, if they've gotten flight permissions from the aviation authorities, that does not give them ethical permission to operate, right? So the community engagement part is really, really key, and it's actually one of the key pillars of the code of conduct that often gets overlooked, or just, there's people take shortcuts with respect to community engagement. So again, it's not just about the informed consent or the implied consent for the application of these technologies. It's also about then the data and the data privacy and how the data gets shared. How do you ensure that it's not just you've not just taken steps to minimize the risk of sharing personal identifying information, but what about demographically identifiable information and taking those steps? But none of this is actually new in any way, shape, or form, right? The data protection protocols have been around for decades. It's not about reinventing the wheel. It's about taking the kinds of protocols that have already been published by the ICRC and making sure to educate those who are more on the industry drone side about the fact that humanitarian principles do exist and data protection protocols do exist, and they're not exempt from them. So a lot of the concerns that we've had and the first-hand experience we've had that has been really negative, to be honest, has been as a result of drone pilots and drone companies who, for the most part, mean well, who then self-deploy in the middle of disaster without having done any kind of disaster response work before, let alone have maybe even worked overseas, and who end up causing more harm than good if they just, compared to if they've just stayed at home and not left their house. So there's a lot that we need to do as a community to really educate drone pilots on the do's and don'ts in terms of just what for us is obvious, but we can't expect everybody to know, to be an expert in humanitarian relief efforts. So anyways, I'll leave it at that for now.
I mean, I think you raise a set of really good points, and also raises, I think, some really interesting ideas around like innovation in this moment. Like I think often think that, well, in order to kind of, have a technology that moves forward or that meets its moment, that it has to adapt to new situations, and that we need to then think about the ethics of the adaptation to the new situation. When in fact, actually, I mean, one of the things that's remarkable about the COVID response is that it is a generalized social impact in many ways. And so, like the mature applications, we call them mature, like being able to do precision agriculture, or create high resolution maps that effectively guide routing or other kinds of things. These are themselves innovative. The context of innovative isn't the thing itself. It's how you're using it to develop something that actually meets the requirements of the moment. And I think the ethical incumbency on us as people that are using technology in these situations is to make sure we're focused on the result and not on the tech for its own sake. I think that's one of the things that was really a genesis of the code of conduct in the first place, was to make sure that you're focused on, the don't part as much as the do part, where you should actually make the result the focus, as opposed to what often was experienced in disaster contexts as, a lot of folks that were looking for advertisements and for ways to, highlight market potential that would then be diverted into other things after the disaster was over. And I think you're seeing a lot of that happen in the pandemic response right now.
Very true.
We can maybe think about that in the context of one of these other questions that came in. Brian Cute asked about, like, specifically, what do we mean by local here? I think it raises this vendor question as well. Is that outside in flow only with respect to services? How will those be defined? And with respect to data collection and analysis, how do we design and implement and share locally? So maybe go into a little more detail about exactly what do we mean by local in this context?
Sure. I mean, I think this is, thanks. This is in context of the flying labs. Yes. So just to point, this has already happening today. It's been happening for several years. Flying Labs are their own independent entities, and they offer a growing range of services to different partners in these 4 programmatic areas that I mentioned at the start of the presentation, so humanitarian, health, development, and environment. They are the ones who offer these services that are in no way limited to, by the way, just data collection. So they also provide data analysis, right? They leverage AI, machine learning tools to provide, to actually help translate this big data of aerial imagery into decision support tools for these decision makers, regardless of what the sector is as well. They also provide trainings directly. They provide certification trainings. In fact, in Senegal Flying Labs and Tanzania Flying Labs are accredited to provide certification drone training in Africa. And that's, by the way, that's a first. It's always been, a drone company from the UK or from the US flying in and costing obviously quite a lot and providing these certifications. So we're localizing that as well. So by localization, what we really mean is we're working with these local experts to provide them with the skills and the technologies that they need based on their priorities. We're an enabler. We don't tell the labs what to do. On the contrary, they tell us what to do in terms of the support that they need, whether that's knowledge exchange, capacity building, technology transfer, helping to create new opportunities for them with new clients, and so on. So that a lot of what we mean by localization is just respecting the fact that local expertise, local knowledge is absolutely essential to making sure these projects are actually sustainable and effective, that they're not top-down, technocentric, foreign-led, but everything contrary to that. But I mean, Andrew, this is a topic that you have thought hard and long on as well. Do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think it was a great response. The only thing I would add is just to cycle back around to the idea that it's not only one way. I think one of the things you emphasized at the beginning is this idea that one of the functions here is to facilitate exchange across a number of areas, many different countries throughout the global South. So local is not like something that overrides network. The purpose of networks in this context is to make sure that there's kind of better support for people everywhere that we need to make these kinds of informed decisions about technology and their uses. So that's, I think, something that needs to be kept in mind. It's not just you can get very narrow in thinking about what locality is, but again, it's a question of who gets to make the decisions, who's in control. And I think that's something that has really been driven home by the pandemic, actually. This question of who gets to be in control of technology has never been more important. So we need to really keep that in mind of all of these implementations.
Yeah, well, absolutely well said. And it also, connected to that as well, more and more this is a network effect, right? More and more what's becoming clear to us is that when one particular flying lab is saying, oh, how do we actually use spraying meaningfully in terms of using this in agriculture, which again is one of those more mature use cases, we don't have to go outside the Flying Labs network, because it just so happens that Côte d'Ivoire Flying Labs in West Africa has actually been doing this for years. They are one of the main movers in Côte d'Ivoire on providing this kind of service. And so when Zambia Flying Labs or Chile Flying Labs or Papua New Guinea Flying Labs or Nepal Flying Labs or Philippines Flying Labs wants to basically get into that space and start offering that particular service in their own countries, it goes directly, lab to lab collaboration, south to south collaboration. We just help facilitate, provide a platform, and help document the best practices and lessons learned. But ultimately, the vast majority of the expertise is already in the network and localized in that sense in different countries. And then they get to learn from each other and start offering different services that obviously is important from revenue streams and so on. And that's just it's great to see that happening when we are actually not involved as We Robotics, and we're just seeing the traffic, the communication traffic happening between labs. That's what ultimately it's all about for us.
Absolutely. I think that's a good point to end on. There were a couple of other questions which we will follow up separately on, but otherwise I think that that's a wrap. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and please feel free to reach out with additional questions and information as needed. Madeline, I can turn it back over to you for any final comments. Thank you, Patrick, too, for joining.
Thank you, Patrick and Andrew. This was a great session, very well attended. Thanks to all the attendees for today's session. Please take a moment to complete our webinar satisfaction poll. The link is in the chat window and will pop up in a new window after you close out the Zoom session. And also look out for a follow-up email with links to the recording and other collateral from today's session. Thank you again for attending, and please have a great rest of your day.